All right. All right, you guys. We're going to be reading To the Top of World Climbing Mount Everest. All right, you guys. Let's get into it. Hope everybody is having a happy Tuesday. And I'm wondering if it's rainy everywhere else. It's rainy here. Okay, so let's hear a little bit about the author. At 4 o'clock in the morning, two mountaineers woke in a small tent perched like a yellow bird on a rocky ledge. They were in the Himalayas, 5 miles up the side of Mount Everest. Okay, so Edmund Hillary peered out at the ice and snow-capped peaks and valleys, that was surrounded by their remote camp. It was May 29th in 1953 today. And Tenzing Norgay would head for the summit of Mount Everest, the world's tallest mountain at 29,000 feet above sea level. Their goal was to be the first climbers to reach the summit. To date, none had succeeded and many had died in the attempt. The challenge was daunting. Any false step on the upward climb and the two mountaineers might plummet off the face of the mountain. Flung like a rag doll into high wind down to the glacier, 800,000 feet below, where Hillary and Tenzing would climb, was no margin for error. They knew severe cold and thin air would sape their strength and dull their senses. Okay, so the moral of the story is Hillary and Tenzing will climb, and they're just basically saying, if you do this, there's no room for air, and that's what the mountains there look like. Okay, and then here's the two people who had actually climbed. Okay, let's get into it. The gusty winds of the previous night had vanished, and the morning was clear, calm, and cold. Hillary and Tenzing were thankful for favorable conditions and hoped that the good weather would last long enough for them to climb the final 1,100 feet to the very top. Stormy weather might well force them to return, as it had the other climbers on their Mount Everest expedition. The men kicked their feet to carve steps in the snow, each movement slowed, ponderous, and deliberate. They were breaking a trail to the top of the world. Steadily, they swung their ice aces to cut steps into the icy slopes. About halfway up the ridge, the powdery snow suddenly gave way, and without warning, Hillary slid several feet before he could stop his fall with his ice axe. Shaken by the experience, Hillary and Tenzing, shall we go on? For these two determined men, the answer would be yes. They would keep going. By 9 a.m., Hillary and Tenzing had reached Mount Everest's south ridge, a razor-like formation jutting straight up into the sky. Hillary took the lead, and methodology began to carve out a ladder of steps, some 40 feet high, for himself and Tenzing to scale the south ridge. We're reading To the Top of the World Climbing Mount Everest. When Hillary noticed Tenzing fumbling with the oxygen mask, he stopped to inspect the equipment. Hillary discovered that ice was accumulating on one of the breathing tubes. In a short time, he cleared the ice and fixed the problem so that Tenzing could breathe freely. Even with their bottled oxygen, breathing was a struggle, especially during the rigorous exercise of climbing. Now, the climbers faced a new danger. A giant tower of rocks blocked their path to the ridge. The men wondered how they would ever surmount the obstacles. The rock was too steep to climb, and from either side, a thick wall of frozen snow lay to the right, and the left side fell straight to the valley below. Okay. On closer inspection, Hillary noticed a long vertical gap where the frozen wall on the right had pulled away from the rock tower. Perhaps they could climb up inside this crevice or giant crack. Hillary wedged himself into the space with his face to the rock wall and his back to the snow wall. By kicking his boots into the snow, he inched his way upward. Then, using his hands, shoulders, knees, and elbows, he wedged himself against the rock and wiggled upward. Luckily, the snow was firm and didn't shatter beneath the crampons as the powdery snow had on the ridge below. The effort to reach the top of the tower was exhausting, and it left Hillary panting for breath. Once at the top, Hillary leaned over and signaled for Tenzing to follow, pulling him on the guide rope he had let out as he scaled the crevice. You see them climbing? Got that heavy equipment on. Look at that. They were both exhausted after making it up and stopped to rest, but only briefly. They checked their oxygen tanks once again, and their breathing was fine. They have to be tired like that. But Tenzing and Hillary knew they had only enough oxygen for a climb of 4.5 hours. Round trip is getting intense for them. There was no time to lose, or Everest would send them back as it had so many climbers before. There they are. They're all getting very tired climbing. Imagine doing that up the hill. We're reading to the top of the world, climbing Mount Everest. At the summit, once again, Hillary asked Tenzing, all right to go on. Tenzing, broad smile, gave him the answer he wanted. The two men pushed on, even more determined to succeed. A series of ridges lay ahead, giant humps of rock covered in snow and ice, each rising higher than the last. The men climbed ever upward, biting their axe into the ice, knowing that somewhere beyond the ridges lay the summit. Hillary checked his watch and saw that it was almost 11:30 a.m. In a few minutes, he and Tenzing would have to turn back, or they would risk running out of oxygen on the trip back to the camp. Would you guys want to climb Mount Everest, or does it seem a little too dangerous? It seems a little too dangerous, according to me. Okay, so look. Hillary checked his watch and saw it was almost 11:30 a.m. In a few minutes, he and Tenzing would have to return back or risk running out of oxygen. Okay, at the top of the next ridge, Hillary looked up and realized that there were no more ridges to climb. Ahead of them lay Mount Everest's summit, a dome of snow and ice, but it was safe to stand on this remote spot, or would the dome crumble away under the climbers' feet? Testing the dome with their axes as they climbed, the two men cautiously stepped into the summit. Success was theirs. They were the first people to stand atop Mount Everest, the highest point on Earth. A beekeeper from New Zealand, Edmund Hillary, and Tenzing Norgay, a guide from Nepal, shared the victory, shaking hands and thumping each other on the back. Then Hillary removed his face mask and took pictures with the camera he had carried all the way to the top. Tucked inside his shirt to keep it warm, they would return home safely. To heroes welcome. They always think they will return home safely. Okay, so Mount Everest, a climber's greatest challenge, is part of the Himalayas, a mountain range that lies between India and Tibet, which is now a Chinese province. It covers most of the country of Nepal and Bhutan. To people of the Himalayan region, the mountain is known as Chomologa, a Tibetan word meaning goddess mother of the world. When he reached the summit, Tenzing paid homage to Chomologa by burying some biscuits, candy, and chocolate in the snow. Hillary buried a crucifix or cross as Colonel John Hunt had requested. The man unfurled the flags of the United Nations, India, and Great Britain. Queen Elizabeth made Edmund Hillary a knight for his achievement. He wrote a number of books about this and other adventures, including his journey across Antarctica in 1958. Hillary also campaigned against deforestation, or cutting down the forests of Nepal. Okay, so Tenzing Norgay was a shepherd. Shepherds lived in several valleys on the southern side of the Mount Everest ridge. In Nepal, they moved Tibet centuries ago, and their language and cultures are closer to those of Tibetans and other Nepali. Okay, so look, shepherds make their living herding animals such as yak and practicing agriculture in the warmer valleys from living in the mountains. Their bodies have adapted to the high altitude and severe weather of the area. So shepherds frequently work as guides on mountaineering expeditions. Tenzing Norgay had been a member of 6 expeditions before teaming up with Hillary in 1953. More than 40 years later, Tenzing's son would attempt to lead another expedition to the top of the world. After Tenzing and Hillary made the first journey to the top, many others have come to climb Mount Everest. Each successful climber draws on the knowledge of all those mountaineers who have climbed it before. In May 1996, several expeditions were attempting to reach the summit at the same time. Several climbers succeeded while others turned back. Some would perish. Rob Hall of New Zealand and Scott Fisher of the United States both led climbing teams. Hall and Fisher were experienced mountaineers who were paid to guide clients who dreamed of conquering Mount Everest. Another expedition led by American David Brashear had a different goal. His goal was to reach the summit with a special camera that would film an IMAX movie, a film that is shown on a larger curving screen that it looks three-dimensional. Brashear's team chose Jamilian Norgay, son of Tenzing Norgay, as their leading shepherd guide. Each team would follow where Hillary and Tenzing Norgay had pioneered. Climbing up the treacherous glacier on their way up, the ice fall at the top of the glacier was a wall of blocks of ice, some as large as houses. Shifting ice formed crevices hundreds of feet deep. Avalanches posed as an even greater threat. At any moment, snow and ice might topple down on a roaring mass that would submerge everything in its path. And then look at this ladder here. You see that ladder he's climbing up. It's very cold out there. So according to weather conditions and their own climbing schedule, each group would move from camp to camp on their way to the summit. So many climbers had passed through Camp 4 at an altitude of 26,000 feet that it became known as the world's highest junkyard. Littered with empty oxygen containers, it is an environmental problem that looks like an industrial waste site. On May 10th, Rob Hall, Scott Fisher, and other members of their groups had reached the summit in Camp 2. David Brashear and members of his team were listening to radio reports of the climb. They were worried because they had taken place at 2 o'clock, too late in the day to ensure a safe return. At 4 p.m., word came that Hall had halted his descent to help a climber who had collapsed. A tragedy was brewing on Mount Everest. A raging blizzard blew in, driven by 60-mile-an-hour winds, and only the climbers who summited and returned quickly were able to survive. Hall, Fisher, and others lost their lives. Isn't that terrible? Despite this tragedy, Brashear and Jamling Norgay continued their expedition. They met with triumph on May 23rd. Members of their group stood on the summit. Jamling Norgay offered up a prayer of thanks to Chamalonga, striking a pose on the summit like that of his father. Jamling smiled for the camera. He left a few things behind on the snow, including a rattle from his daughter and photographs of his mother and father. In this family, braving Mount Everest is traditional. Whew, that's very sad about the two people, Hall and Fisher, who lost their lives during the, climbing of Mount Everest. And that is the end to the top of the world. See you guys on the next one.